speakers are, first of all, Cindy Hahamovitch, who is Professor of History at the College of William and Mary. Cindy is a distinguished scholar of American history in transnational perspective. Her most recent book is No Man's Land, Jamaican Guest Workers in America and the Global History of Deportable Labor, published by Princeton University Press in 2011, which won more book awards than I can name, and if Cindy were a soldier, her medals would cause her to tilt forward with distinction, with very great distinction.
First of all, let me say, for the sake of truth in advertising, that I just met Lara today, and she's not paying me. I don't have anything critical to say about this book. I think it's absolutely fantastic. First, let me say the writing is sublime. It is just beautiful. In fact, when reading the introduction, I found myself mouthing the words in my head like a 5-year-old. I realized I wasn't paying attention to what they were saying. I was just enjoying the sound of them, and I had to concentrate more on what she was actually telling us, and that this incredible writing persists on every page of the book, which I think is really, really rare. Now, I always hated, I'm a reviews editor for Later, so I read a lot of reviews of books, and I kind of hate it when people talk about their own books in reviews of other people's books. But if you'll indulge me,
We will.
yeah, okay, I have no choice anyway. I want to reference my book briefly because Lara succeeds brilliantly at something I failed at miserably in No Man's Land. When I began that book, which is a study of Jamaican guest workers who travels back and forth and are still traveling back and forth between Jamaica and the U.S., largely to do farm work, I made a promise in my grant applications. I promised that because these men were going back and forth, sometimes working in the U.S. 5 or 6 months out of the year for as many as 20 years in a row, that I would talk about the ideas and understandings that they brought with them to the U.S., ideas about race and rights and rebellion, and then think about what they learned, how those ideas changed in the course of their experiences in the United States, and then how the newly formed ideas resonated back in Jamaica in struggles over race and rights and independence. Hopefully nobody checks whether grantees actually deliver on what they said they were going to do, because I didn't do any of that in the book. I couldn't find out a damn thing on those questions. I couldn't find out anything from archival sources, but not even in oral interviews. And I did a lot of oral interviews. I talked to men, for example, who worked in Florida in the 1960s at the height of the American Civil Rights Movement and knew nothing about it, or professed to know absolutely nothing about it, total blank. So I was completely bowled over when I began reading Radical Moves and realized that Lara's book did precisely what I had failed at, only she didn't just do it for Jamaicans going back and forth to the U.S., but she did it for Bajans and for Trinidadians and for St. Vincenters and for men and women from all over the West Indies who were traveling, reaching over, as Jamaicans would say, not just to the U.S., but to Cuba and Panama and British Guyana and Venezuela and elsewhere. It's a remarkable enterprise, and I can't even imagine taking it on. So in essence, Radical Moves, to me, is an intellectual history from the bottom up. It's an intellectual history, though, of some of the most migratory people in the world. Barbadians, for example, Barbados is a tiny place. There are sugarcane farms in Florida that are bigger than Barbados. But Barbados per capita, Barbadians per capita migrate more often than any other people in the world. So this is a hard thing to do, to study people on the move, and that's precisely what she did. And she somehow manages to do it without lumping people together as sort of monolithic categories. Workers, migrants, even Bajans and Jamaicans. She somehow manages to see very ordinary people that she studies as individuals, even as she pays attention to the religious and the political and the social and even the musical movements that they crafted on the move. Now, Lara's book is a work of Caribbean history, but it's also, I think, a major intervention in U.S. immigration history. So I want to turn to that now. And I apologize in advance for vastly oversimplifying my field, but I think we can reduce it to 2 main approaches. The first, beginning with Oscar Hanlon in the 1950s, involved many, many historians, immigration historians, in the study of ethnic identity. So for Hanlon, recent scholars, borrowing from people like Eric Hobsbawm and Terry Rangers, who talked about ethnic identity as an constantly invented and reinvented thing. Most of these historians studied the 19th century, when, with the exception of the Chinese, few immigrants faced any impediments other than their own poverty in coming to the United States. Now, the second concern of immigration historians, and this is a much more recent one, began, I think, when historians started to study the 20th century and couldn't help but see that there was law after law after law restricting immigrants from coming to the United States. And so they tended to move away from issues of identity formation and toward issues of policy and state formation. And I'm thinking of people here like May Nye and Erica Lee and Kelly Little Fernandez and many others who caused, or I think are causing, a reconsideration of the field as a whole. For example, they see Chinese exclusion not as an exception to a general rule of American openness and welcome, but the beginning of the rise of an exclusionist state. A state that dramatically hardened borders and created the bureaucratic structures, inspection stations, visas, passports, and so on, that made immigrating to the U.S. a much more difficult and much more discriminatory process. Now, historians in this camp also focus on ordinary people, but more as objects of exclusionary policies, not so much as agents of change on their own. It seems to me that Lara's book, Radical Moves, combines these two approaches to brilliant effect, and I think that it's much more than the sum of its parts. She shows, for example, how Caribbean migrants who had been traveling for years within what she calls the Circum-Caribbean, and beyond it to places like New York and my hometown, Montreal, were stymied by restrictionist legislation, not just in the U.S., but in places like Panama and Venezuela, and how their forced return to the West Indies led them to transform the Pan-Africanist and anti-imperialist and civil rights movements they had earlier created. So the sense of who they were and who they identified with was shaped not just by where they went, but also where they were not allowed to go. So she's really put these two fields together in very, very dramatic ways. And she has fantastic chapters on Rastafarianism and reggae, which she shows were products, at least in large part, of that forced return to Jamaica. I think I jumped myself here. I'm right all over your text. Now, there were already studies of Black Caribbean elite activists, the editors, the intellectuals, and others who created Pan-African, anti-imperialist, and anti-racist organizations, primarily in New York, but who were connected to other people like them around the world. And Lara doesn't ignore those people, but she reveals the tensions between those sort of self-styled intellectuals, the classes, as in the upper class, and the masses, right? The classes were disdainful of Marcus Garvey, who were the heroes of many of the subjects in the book. They were disdainful of West Indians' attraction to less restrained religious practices. They were even disdainful of many of the dances, the new dances that these Caribbean migrants were performing. So Lara sees ordinary labor migrants feeding these Pan-Africanist, anti-imperialist, and anti-racist movements, but on their own terms and in dialogue with these sort of self-styled leaders. And she has a great chapter on the Black Press, which I've already emailed. I have a former student working on the Black Press, and she's got it. And I've already emailed him. You got to read this chapter because I think it's a model for how you study the audience of a newspaper and the ways in which people use newspapers in unintended ways, not quite how the editors perhaps imagine. For example, to communicate with relatives and friends in other countries. So rather than seeing ordinary people as followers of anti-imperialists in another chapter she shows how labor migrants asserted their rights as British subjects in the early chapters to defend themselves in the places where they worked in the Caribbean. So they would assert their Britishness in self-defense. And it was only later when British colonial officials failed to defend them against racist immigration restrictions that they began to join these anti-imperialist movements in greater numbers. So it's a real shift away, I think, from the existing leadership on these activists in a much, much broader focus. Again, a bottom-up focus, but still an intellectual history. She's also sympathetic to her subjects, but she avoids romanticizing them. So, for example, she shows how West Indians, having been victims of discriminatory legislation in places like Cuba and Venezuela, turn around and went back to places like Jamaica and passed restrictionist legislation against Asians and Syrians. Right? So this is not a particularly touchy-feely book. She has this critical lens that she sees everything through. At the same time that she's critical in places of her subjects, their moves were radical, she says, that's the title, because they're radicalized both by their contacts with each other, with the fact that they're meeting people from around the Caribbean in all the places they go and interacting with people everywhere they go. Those experiences are radicalizing, but they're also radicalized by the racist immigration restrictions that are thrown up against them. Now, let me end with going back to autobiography. Sorry, again. I was struck when I finished the book with how poorly the Jamaican guest workers I studied fit into her story. And I'd love you to address this later. And this is not because she's wrong or because the Jamaican guest workers that I studied were traveling in a later period after the jazz age from World War II on, but I think because the U.S. employers who imported them, and I'm using that word strategically, you avoid it, but I mean they imported them like wheat or motherboards, as those employers worked assiduously to ensure that Jamaicans' moves were not radical moves through this guest work program. So, for example, the first group of people who come from the U.S. as guest workers, to the U.S. as guest workers during World War II, were precisely like the people that Lara describes in the books. They were often well-traveled. They had been to places like Panama. They had been forced to go back to Jamaica when the Panama Canal construction was over, and then they were quick to get on the ships to come to the United States during World War II, or they had been in the British West Indies Regiment, or they had already traveled in the U.S. They were dock workers, there were athletes among them, there were the son of Jamaica's first black car dealer was in the mix. They were a very well-educated group compared to the Jamaican people as a whole, and they were very self-assertive in the United States. They represented themselves as British subjects. They asserted their right to be treated as war workers and not just as farm workers, and they complained about racism wherever they went, and sometimes felt themselves to be more militant and superior to African Americans, which is something that I address in the book. So, for example, Jamaicans in New Jersey integrated restaurants when they were refused service. Okay. That was the first group. But in the post-war period, when employers gained control of this program and were able to take over the recruitment process themselves, they hand-picked people who did not fit that profile. If you had a stamp in your passport that showed you had worked anywhere else in the world, you weren't getting in, right? If you were too educated, you weren't getting in. If you didn't have a family and a tiny piece of land tying you back to Jamaica, you weren't getting in. If you were a sugarcane cutter in Jamaica, you weren't going to get a job as a sugarcane cutter in Florida because you were quite likely to be a union member, and they didn't want you, right? So they were strategically picking people who were not worldly, who were not educated, and who were not likely to make their moves radical. And when people did make their moves radical, when they struck, sometimes in mass strikes, which would happen 1 or 2 times a year throughout the entire program, they would be deported instantly. And so perhaps it's not that surprising that I didn't see those connections between the civil rights movement and the independence movement in Jamaica and similar movements in the U.S., because these people were so cut off, literally living in barbed wire surrounded camps in Florida. So, post-World War II U.S. employers, it seemed to me, de-radicalized Caribbean migrants' radical moves. Well, in conclusion,